Now, here to the presentation, we're going to start the session. This is the Centre for Deaf Studies, and we're sharing this presentation with CISLI, the Council of Irish Sign Language Interpreters. So it's a really joint promotion of interpretation as a career, so that as an option. And we're lucky to have two presenters here. Vanessa O'Connell, whose sign name is this. Vanessa? And she's the PR person for CISLI. And we also have Senan Dunn, who's the vice chairperson of CISLI. And they'll talk more about their role. And the reason why we picked this topic, for the same reason as both of us would have concerns about interpretation as a career. People would think about, oh, maybe I'll do a short course and I'll be able to learn how to become an interpreter. I can do the alphabet so I can become an interpreter fairly quickly. But in reality, it's very in-depth training and intense. Here in the Centre for Deaf Studies, we're the only centre north and south of Ireland that provide this type of training at undergraduate level for students to become interpreters. And it's a 4-year programme. So a 4-year programme, and that includes, for instance, you have the first 2 years, which are focusing on general modules, deaf education, introduction to the deaf community, working with the deaf community. And after the end of second year, depending on results, skills in ISL and in TIP, which is translation and interpretation, philosophy and practice, that's a module. So once you've passed those to a high level, then you can go into the interpreting strand. So it's a 4-year program, and at the end, you're awarded a bachelor degree in deaf studies. And if you have completed your course, you can register with RISLI, the Register of Irish Sign Language Interpreters, which is an independent body who will ask you for your criteria, your Garda vetting and so on. But here we focus in on the course itself. Please remember that the course and the training to become an interpreter is a very generic course for generic interpreting. So there's no specialization in specific domains like legal or medical domain. And there are different reasons for that as to why it has worked out like that. Firstly, we're limited because we have a limited number of spaces, which is 20 per cohort each year. So 15 out of 20 come from the CAO results. So people who've come straight from the Leaving Cert, they're always quite young, that cohort. And then we have another 5 places that are held for various people, mature students, applications. So once you're aged over 23, and that is an interview process to make sure that you meet the criteria to be admitted. And then people from disability sector, including deaf people. Then we have the Trinity Access Programme, TAP, people who live in deprived areas or areas that they need extra support, often involved in the TAP programme. And we would love to expand that, those places, those 5 places and the 20 places, but we're limited resources. If you'd like further information, please look at our website for further details. Just to hold off on that, I can see somebody trying to join in, so I just wanted to welcome them in. Thanks for your patience. Okay, somebody's trying to join there. I'll put some of that information after the recording is finished. I'll put a link in. You can find where you can get further information and who you can contact for the Centre for Deaf Studies here in Trinity. That's my part finished. I'm going to hand over to our 2 presenters, Vanessa and Senan, and they're going to focus in on a discussion about interpretation, and maybe we'll have a chance for questions and answers at the end. Please welcome Vanessa. Sure, where I'm to stand here. Hello, everyone. As John Bosco mentioned, my sign name is Selin. I am the Vice Chair of SISLI. I'm going to talk about interpreting situation in Ireland, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the history of interpretation here in Ireland, ISL interpretation, before there was any kind of formal accreditation or education. So sometimes it was a hearing person who was able to sign, any person who could use, not necessarily called ISL at the time, but sign, maybe from the schools, worked in the deaf schools as a teacher who was able to sign. They were used as interpreters, or people from the national chaplaincy, Christian brothers or priests or nuns who worked within the deaf community, worked as acting as interpreters. So people who were used often for maybe interpretation at local level or religious level, weddings, funerals, and other religious commemorations. So very much related to spiritual, pastoral life and pastoral care. And then maybe somebody might be lucky enough to have a family member who signed, who is willing to sign for them at certain occasions, or people who had hearing children who were able to communicate for them. That was, and sometimes, rarely, but it did happen, sometimes a workmate or a friend would be able to act as interpreter prior to the first establishment of a course here, the programme back in 1992 to 94. So that's where professional interpreting started here. But prior to that, there was nothing like that. So in the past, there was a lot of difficulties in those times. As I mentioned, when people could sign, they were taught, but a lot of deaf people weren't familiar with that type of style because of their education, because of the prohibition of sign language, because of the use of oralism. So maybe they could sign, but hearing people who were taught didn't necessarily understand that signing style either. So they were often at cross purposes and didn't understand each other, native signers and people who became familiar with signs. So that's really around the 4-year program here. You research more about in depth about the history of ISL and the source of it. But prior to the establishment of a course, the first course, there were deaf schools that were quite large at the time. There was a primary and post-primary, but very few people. It was really rare that anybody got to third level. Sometimes people who had a little bit of hearing might have used the loop system or self-studied. And then after the professionalisation of interpretation, there were more deaf people had access to universities. So as I mentioned, there's concerns about the number of interpreters. Certainly we need more. In the medical domain, obviously it's very sensitive. Back then in the past, people would bring family members to communicate for them, sometimes even their own children. But obviously it's very private, personal and sensitive information, and quite an obligation on that. So interpreters who came from any professional courses had a code of conduct, had professional boundaries and understanding around, and deaf people felt they had more dignity in their own private and personal life when they wanted to consult with the medical practitioners without family intervention, or perhaps sometimes not even telling them the full story or not getting the full information. I'm sure Vanessa would have stories to tell around that. So we wanted to have less of those kind of issues and problems with professionalisation. The other issue was around employment. So there's more choices in employment when interpretation is provided. It looks like one political party used to have the phrase, we've done a lot more to do. So the same with the provision of ISL. The ISL Act, it feels like it's achieved a lot for the deaf community, but we know, yes, the signs are positive, but we still have much more to do. To talk about, as I've talked about the medical domain, to talk about other domains, people obviously have the right to legal access, protection, and to enjoy their rights. And as we mentioned, there's a 4-year course here without any specialisation. So it's really within CPD training or people's own self-study, that they have a basic idea of working in the legal domain. But we certainly need a lot more of that and access to the legal domain for deaf people. So that's a little bit of the history for it. I think I might hand over to Vanessa now, and she might describe what it's like working as an interpreter.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. So really, I think the kind of aim of today is to talk more about the power of real life stories. So that's why I'm here, to give my examples, to talk about myself. Growing up with a brother who was deaf, as the same as Senna mentioned, it was often family members who were used as interpreters. And my first memory, I remember my mother and father always telling me to explain things to my brother. Tell him, explain all these stories. And really, it was just between the two of us. It was more like family sign, the way we grew up together. We kind of produced our own ideas. It wasn't a full in-depth message of sign language. So that's how we grew up. And I started to study carpentry. Yep, started to study that, started still using my hands, very different way to now, but yes, using my hands. And I carried on and I realized it just wasn't for me. So I remember one time when I was young, I saw in the newspaper an advertisement, and it was a course back in 1990, I want to say 1992, 1994. 1992 to 1994. And it was an old newspaper, and it was 2 years old, and I was like, oh, I was so upset. I'd never seen the course at the time. I only saw it afterwards. So then I started to work for the NAD as a communication support worker. But really, I was kind of more frustrated at the communication, the breakdown of communication when I was communicating with deaf people. Yes, it had started to improve, but it wasn't quick enough. So I finished at the NAD, and then I started working in a job as a job coach. So I was working as a job coach and in a disability centre. And everyone's like, oh, you have sign, you can communicate with deaf people. And there would be queues and queues of deaf people coming to me. And I said, no, we really need an interpreter for this. But it was rejected time and time again. The same old excuse of we have no budget. So I was obviously disappointed, and I ended up leaving that job because there was just more frustration and this communication breakdown consistently. So I went back to college, and it was hard work. I won't pretend it was easy. I was a mature student at the time. So I went back to study. I passed my 2 years. It was great. I was ecstatic. And then I went into the world of work, and where did I start? And I always say the interpreters start in education. It's always the same. We always say, get your graduation, get your certificate, and then go and start in education. And wow, it was I started in DIT myself, in Bolton Street. And it was an engineering course, a student who was studying engineering. And wow, look, I was lucky. I had a little bit of background in carpentry. So I had a little bit of background knowledge. I knew a little bit of what I was talking about. I kind of, when they were talking about buildings and institutions and things like that, and the foundations and how that was all kind of grafted and groundwork. And I was like, okay, I have a bit of knowledge in the back of my head here. I do have a bit of visual understanding, and then linking in the sign language, the background really helped. So yeah, the student was very happy. They wanted me back Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the full week. And I was like, oh, that's too much. I'm going to be wrecked. So it ended up the 5 years. I was with the same student through their full 5-year course. And then they graduated and they got a first class honours. I'm not saying that was because of me at all, but you know, I had a little bit of involvement there, just the smallest bit. But really, it was kind of after that I realised that we were kind of using a lot of our own signs in this environment. So when I went outside, I felt a little bit lost. I was like, okay, there just wasn't, it wasn't as smooth. There was a lot of bad habits from this 5 years being with the one student. And I don't mean like bad, I just mean like obviously they passed, it was brilliant, it went well, but I mean habits from that environment that I kind of picked up on because I was there for so long. So I decided to come back and go to college again. I started first studying the 2-year diploma. And then when I came back now, I passed the 4-year course, the degree. So I came back for the 3rd year with the first group that I graduated with the first time with the 4-year course. But I started honing my skills, I was improving, I was honoured to come back. But then again, I went out into the interpreting environment and I felt my experience of really the outside world was very different to my college experience. They weren't on the same path. I felt like I needed to study again. I feel like the linguistics and all the meaning of college, yeah, but my 2-year diploma, I feel like I was a little bit lost in that sense. And it wasn't easy, as I said, it wasn't easy, but it got better with experience. So that's really, I know in Ireland, most countries are the same. There's a history of interpreters. A lot of the time it's white females, and that's who your interpreter is. And that's the majority of your numbers. So really the aim for here today is we want to try and encourage a lot more people, a lot more diversity to come into the interpreting field, because young students, a lot of people who are from a migrant background, they feel like, no, I don't know if I can come in, I don't know if I can become an interpreter, I'm not sure. So I think that we really do need to try and give more guidance, more guidance counsellor as well, that kind of perspective. You need to be able to encourage more and more people, more and more students from different backgrounds and different diversities. And then one more part of really my lived experience as well. I don't know if it's a negative thing against a whole guidance counsellor, but I do remember my younger days. I remember being diagnosed with dyslexia. It was a guidance counsellor that told me that I would never learn a second language. And so I was kind of like just brought away from that, and I felt like, no, I can't possibly do it. And at the time I was exempt from the Irish language as well. So spoken Irish language, I didn't have to go into that class at all. I was free because I was diagnosed with dyslexia. And it was years later, I was interpreting in big conferences, and I saw actually the face in the crowd of my guidance counsellor from back in the day, and she ended up coming up to me and being like, oh my God, well done, Vanessa. I haven't seen you in years. How are you? I saw you on television during the COVID times. And I was like, yes. And it's in my second language. So a little bit cheeky, but at the same time, I think that if students have a disability or neurodiversity, or maybe think, no, there's too many barriers, I can't possibly become an interpreter, I think we need to encourage them. It's more about encouraging people. So I hope your guidance counsellors will bring you all in, and I hope there'll be big numbers this year signing up for the CAO to come here. I really hope so. So myself and Senan, we want to talk about working as a team. So here in Ireland, and I'm sure other countries are the same, we're playing a little bit of catch up, to be honest. But we have what we call deaf hearing interpreter teams. So maybe Senan would like to come in and explain a little bit more about that.
Yes, you're right. Deaf and hearing teams, but just if we want to think about that, it's not only deaf hearing people that can be interpreters, deaf people can be as well. And also even hard of hearing people, there's nothing to stop them. There's reasonable accommodation for that also. But the example of deaf and hearing teams, maybe you're wondering why that would be the case. So we have a 4-year program here. People study ISL and linguistics and so on. But there's also sometimes people with other languages, like say, for instance, the deaf people who've come from Ukraine. So deaf people often have to work into kind of international sign and then translate. Then we have a hearing interpreter translating from ISL into English. So it's a team that would work together translating from international. So it's that kind of service that's provided at the moment. So there's a lot of people working as deaf interpreters, working to the same level as hearing interpreters. And another way deaf interpreters can work is in translation. Say, for instance, English published by public bodies, like around referendums or elections and so on, that's translated into ISL and recorded and then disseminated. So they work as translators in that sense. There's a lot of things that deaf interpreters can do. But we badly need more hearing interpreters at the moment. I think, if we think about Finland having the same population, around 5 million, they have about 650 interpreters. Maybe that could be old information at this stage for the similar population, and they say it's not enough. And at active interpreters, there's about 100 to 120 active interpreters, but it's certainly not enough. If you think of it, the comparison to Finland with this comparable population, and we also have to think of a lot of the stakeholders that are involved. There's a lot of employment for interpreters now. Not just in person, but also remotely. You can work in service. There's a service called IRIS, the Irish Remote Interpreting Service. And so people can have remote conversations if they want to have appointments or book appointments. They can do that through, if they want to deal with different public services, they can do that through an interpreter who's online, who will make a phone call for them. So a lot of deaf people use that service, and that's available on Saturday as well, a few hours and also a few hours on Sunday. And there's a huge demand for that service. And we certainly need more interpreters. We need more personnel for that. Would you like to add anything to that? Just to add, I want to add one more thing to that. Thanks for your presentation there. Really, this is for any career guidance counsellors out there. We know that every year we receive a lot of new students, and we always ask them, why did you pick the course? What was your interest in here? We often, it's a natural question to ask, to find out what their motivation is for coming here. A very high percentage of them say, I want to help the deaf. And this is not really what we're looking for. That's not the quality we're looking for in an interpreter, but it's natural. That's okay that people say that they want to help. But really the quality of the person we're looking for is firstly that they're very much interested in language, in cultural exchange, in processing within different languages. So helping deaf people, it's a fine, noble cause, but we need to think about other things. And also a student, one of my colleagues, Sarah Sheridan, is currently doing a student survey questionnaire to see about the impact of first year. It's a longitudinal study. And many of them had said it's a culture shock. Culture shock was a bit surprising from us because they were like coming from a hearing school into here. So remember, the course is here. Spoken language interpreters and sign language interpreters are very different in how they're trained. And the big difference is the modality. So with spoken language interpreters, it's around speaking, listening skills, or some writing skills. Maybe, for instance, if it's English to French, you're going to use the same modality. So speech, listening skills, reading and writing skills. If you're talking about sign languages, you're using your hands, as Vanessa mentioned, using your hands. But it's not just that, it's around your eye contact. eye contact maintenance is very important for interpreters. You're not looking all around the place. So normally in the hearing world, people will look around them. Their eye gaze will move around the room as they talk. But eye contact is maintained here, which is a bit of a culture shock for many students who come here. And the movement of your face and non-manual features in your hands. So it might be a bit of a culture shock. They need to be prepared for that. Nothing can really prepare you really for a culture shock. You just come into it. But funny, a lot of students had told me that by the first Christmas or the second Christmas after they've been here, they were going home signing with their own family, and their family was saying, "Oh, what are you doing?" Or maintaining too much eye contact. So it feels like we've trained them well here. So we're really looking for people who are interested in cultural exchange, mediation, the language processing, that they are expressive as well. I'm sure that Vanessa and Senan could add to that. And of course, it's important to think about the various skills a student could possibly have. But also if we think about if you're presenting to students, for example, TY students, I know that I presented to various TY classes, various schools, through the Irish Deaf Society, through the advocacy group that they have there. They're often willing to work with us, and we incorporate information around interpretation there. And there's plenty of information available about studying and becoming an interpreter at the Centre for Deaf Studies and as a possible future career. So you can contact through deaf.ie, www.deaf.ie, you'll see information there. And we know that in November and December it was very busy, some queries around that. And also if you'd like a basic taster in sign language course, many of the schools really enjoy that and really flourish. Yeah. And also you can come here to the Centre for Deaf Studies. There's an open day in Trinity, and you can observe classes if you like. And that's great, you know, to see the classes actually happening, to see how they operate. That's something you can think about. Do you have anything to add, either of you? Maybe open it to questions now. Okay, just well done. I'm happy that you're talking about deaf awareness training as well and working with the TY cohorts. So I was just giving you a thumbs up. I don't really have a question to ask.
Have you any comments about it? Okay, thank you very much, Elaine, anyway. Thank you. Any other questions? Any other comments?
Hi, just something that occurred to me. I know obviously you're trying to encourage guidance counsellors, various guidance counsellors, but maybe related to that, someone with some kind of funding to increase the numbers of interpreters going into the Centre for Deaf Studies. I know obviously you're trying to recruit that interpreter, but we have limited resources in Trinity. So how do they select? Do you select who's the best, or how do you select, you know, say for instance, the best from the worst, or who do you want to respond to that?
Okay, so it's a good question. And it's an issue that comes up time and time again every year. People ask, why don't you expand your numbers more than 20? So primarily, really, this course, the funding is by both the government and then, of course, by TCD themselves. And they said you must have the limit of 20. Sometimes we're wondering why we can't expand to 40, 50. But without the extra staff and the extra resources, it's just impossible. We're not able to accept that many people. And when you look at other languages like Russian and Spanish and Italian, you can see they have really big classes of maybe 50 or 60, and then they go home themselves and they can listen online and kind of hone their skills themselves. But here, it's just a different experience. So that's the primary reason. And then secondary, Swiss, we've approached them a few times talking about expanding resources and things like that, but it kind of has been put on the long finger maybe. At the same time, it might interest you to know here at the moment, for the last 4 years, students who have come in to start the course, they don't have to have skills in ISL. We would prefer them to have some kind of basic skill, some kind of basic sign. The idea for a perfect world is secondary school, post-primary should have some kind of ISL subjects. It's the same as French and English. Like if we have that skill, or if you have a French or another language, you have a skill that you can hone when you come here. So I know Vanessa, as she spoke about coming back again, and she felt like the skills level is so different when you come in. So she obviously had lots of experience when she came in, but can you imagine in first year, some people come in, have maybe basic sign, have family background, or have their own interest in sign language, but some people have nothing. And it can be a lot of frustration on the staff with that kind of varied experience. So if it became a Leaving Cert subject in the school, yes, we have ISL in the Leaving Cert, and the Leaving Cert Applied has ISL, but it's not recognised as a university subject when you're coming into a university, which is a bit of a letdown. So there are lots of different issues, but it is a good question. I don't know if anyone has anything to add. Is that okay? And then there's just one more. Just hold for 1 second. We're just waiting for the interpreter. Yeah.
Just throwing this out there too, if Trinity were to move, the Centre for Deaf Study was to move to, say, Maynooth or DCU, would there be a different ruling around expanding the numbers, or would it be still the same in any other university? Or is it a specific Trinity-specific policy?
Another good question. I feel like it's wishful thinking. I feel it'll be the same. I think DCU, Maynooth, TCD, all other universities, they often relying on funding. And if you have no funding, then there's no point. It's a waste of time. It's the funding that's important. It's the funding that's the key part of the process. And I know IDS has often kind of said, we need more, we need expansion, we need to expand the numbers. But it is a great question about moving, but it really depends on other universities. I can't talk for them, but I feel like most of them will have the same restrictions as well. So I hope that answers your question. Okay. Just one more point of information. Don Bosco was mentioning about the language, different spoken languages. And I just want to let you know that as for career guidance, you can, for post-primary, I know it's different for primary, but for post-primary, I know that you can join Language Connect. So Language Connect, it's a website. If you Google it, you can see it. And they provide languages that include ISL. And I know that they go to different destinations to teach that. And I think it's like an 8-week program, 1.5 hours for every session. And it kind of gets children interested, that hour a week. And it could become more and more popular then. So it is worth looking at. just kind of introducing to an introduction to basic ISL. So just that's another point. So maybe it's interesting for TY to encourage that kind of idea from that age.
That's a perfect timing to talk about that. I'm kind of stand here to be corrected on this, but ISL was the second or third most popular subject within the Language Connect program, which is really interesting. The children I know that were very interested, obviously, in the visual and very animated, but I'm pretty sure that that was the case. Is there any more? I can see that there's one question in the chat. I'm just going to look at that. Okay, thanks, Elena. Just going to repeat your question for the interpretation. You were saying, what are the entry requirements for that course? I missed at the beginning. Yeah, is that the right question you're asking? Yes. Maybe you can show if that's the correct question with the thumbs up. I can't see now, it's too far. Yes, yes. Okay. Okay, thanks. For this course, if I remember off the top of my head from the prospectus for the course, there's different entry points. So people who have just completed their Leaving Cert, they have to have 350 points, I think it is. So that fluctuates. The points requirements fluctuates depending on demand. But I know that the last year was 352 points. So roughly around 350. And you have to have H4 in the English language. And you have to have, there are restricted pathways for deaf and hard of hearing. So that who are fluent in sign as well. So they can have fluency in sign requirement, but that has to be submitted and proof of the fact that you're deaf, either from your school or your audiologist or peace commissioner, like a sort of notary or an oath to say that you are actually deaf. Then if once that's received, there's, you know, and you're assessed, you can come here and normally around April through that path. So so that English requirement can be replaced by ISL. And I know that the first time it was had 2 deaf people who were assessed for that, and that was a real experience through that process, because it's always the focus on English, so it was great to have that exemption. And just to clarify, for guidance counsellors, maybe they're wondering why there's a restriction for deaf people. Most deaf and hard of hearing people are literate, they can read and write English. They have a choice between English and ISL. But for many people that are deaf or hard of hearing, they're more likely to struggle. They might not necessarily achieve H3 or H4. Some do, some can. But you have to remember there needs to be a bit more flexibility and accommodation and choice around that. So there's a choice given around fluency in sign, in ISL. And for many deaf people all over Ireland, they may not have not exposure necessarily to sign. They might not have that. So sometimes they come here to be assessed around that, and then using their competencies in English and some competency in ISL, but the H4 is the benchmark, if that's clear, Elena. And I'm sure Trinity College have the prospectus, current prospectus online. I can put that in the link under the resources under the recording of this session. Just to hold, Elena is typing something I need to see with my glasses over there. Okay, thank you. Elena said thank you. Okay. I think Elaine is going to ask another question. Just one moment. Okay, again. Stephen mentioned about the Language Connects project. I think it was a brilliant idea, but my concern is that the people who teach the sign, they may, like Vanessa mentioned, you know, she used growing up, not coda, but family sign. So you could have people who use their own family sign. I know even my own children, my daughter might use some family sign, which is more to do with sort of our own way of communicating. But if we think about Language Connect, and it was supported by Centre for Deaf Studies, who provided training for some people who were coders, who didn't want to go in, weren't necessarily academic, but wanted some support around how to teach. And they did some modules around linguistics. And but I'm just wondering, is there any short-term course that we could have for interpreters? I know that it would make a big difference for deaf people, coders, that have grown up with sign language children of deaf adults. And I'm just wondering, is it a consideration that we could do maybe evening courses where students could go in and become interpreters in that way? If there would be maybe more demand than the 4-year process, you know, and rather than people end up with 8 years program with an evening course. I don't want to have that. Maybe it's a long question.
That looks like it might be a question for me. Senna can have a rest there for that one now. Okay, so you're right. I know at the moment, Carmel, one of our colleagues, Carmel, your sister, in fact, she's involved in training. What would you say? She said kind of the pressure from Language Connect. It's kind of it's very popular, of course, but at the same time, I think the 6 or 8 week program, it's not specifically like on teaching grads, it's more like playing games, kind of having fun with the language. In that respect, it's more kind of encouraging an interest for people going forward. So you're right, it is a good idea. We could maybe see if there's any funding for something like that, for kind of a continuous professional development for those who are involved in kind of teaching in Language Connect. I know you're talking about codas. It is something we could see if there was money for. I know they're funded by the Department of Education and Skills in that way. But yeah, now the evening courses, just to let you know, we have 2 kind of continuous discussions that go on. First here at TCD, Sarah Sheridan, she, and along with Professor Lorraine Leeson, they have both finished drafting they both have a postgraduate degree draft proposal for people who have qualified in kind of different areas like teaching, counselling, but having a pathway for someone who's come through sign language. I myself,
or people who are in the Centre for Deaf Studies previously. So this was pre-COVID that they originally drafted this proposal, but it has to be self-financing was the answer they got back. So it would mean that students would have to pay for that postgraduate. I don't know how much, but I'm expecting possibly a few thousand. And then COVID took over, and then they went back to that, and they continued again with that proposal. So it's still, at the moment, it's almost at approval, but it still has to be, and there's some tweaks that need to happen around that, because it has to be updated, obviously, after the time lapse. But that would be working with Queen's University in Belfast as well, have established a program, a postgraduate degree in interpretation. And there are different strands, and one of them is BSL and ISL. So the others are other various spoken language, Irish, French, Mandarin. So they're hoping to start on that, and the funding is from Stormont Assembly. So that's the funding for now. So they've just obviously announced the general election in Britain. So there may be further delays on that. I don't know that that would be the case. But one of the things that is interesting around that is Queen's University have approached us to work together with some kind of shared component, shared modules. So obviously they have BSL in Northern Ireland and ISL in the South. So some common grounds around ethics, various attitudes towards interpretation, and that would be really interesting. That's ongoing discussions that are happening now. And so as regards a postgrad, obviously you'd need a BA level first. You have to have that. So there are two things that are ongoing at the moment. That answers your question.
In terms of that.
You mentioned the three strands there. So ISL teaching, I know the Irish Deaf Society, we have level 5 and we plan to have level 6 QQI. So we encourage students there, and we encourage people to go to the Centre for Deaf Studies and to focus on interpreting and deaf studies, of course. And of course, audiology and speech therapy and all those other options are important. But I'm just thinking, you know, maybe that could be an option. We worked with you all on that.
Okay, it's an idea we can keep in mind. Okay, we'll bring it to a close now. I think I'm just looking at the time. I don't want to run over time. So I would like to thank both Vanessa and Senan as well for sharing their ideas and promoting the idea of becoming an interpreter as a career option. Any of you who are career guidance counsellors, you can contact us. You can, if you have any further questions, we're more than happy to provide information, and Cicely are the same. With the support of IDS and all the other organisations. So just a very quick bit of information. We have a little bit of TCD news here. We actually have the third most interest in CAO points. It's come up by 42%.
In the applications this year.
Applications this year. So a little bit of news for us. So maybe people are starting to become interested, and we'll wait and see. So I just want to bring Vanessa and Senan up to say thank you. So good evening and thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. And thank you to the interpreters also.